Hi everybody, I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and I want to start this by saying that by far the best part of this strange career I found myself in is getting a chance to meet the people out there on the other side of the camera, and never more so when I get a chance to meet the members of the U.S. military. Just yesterday, prior to shooting this anyway, was given the signal honor of being taken out to the USS Spruance. Spent a couple of hours on board this guided missile destroyer. Got to meet the crew, and there's so much to speak about there. I believe I'll make it a firewall for next week. But there are two things that happened during the last 24 hours that are deeply disturbing to me, and they should be disturbing to you as well. 2 nights ago at dinner, I spoke to a person who had been in command of an entire fighter squadron. And he had basically said that we keep our best aircraft out on the fleet, needless to say, on the pointy end of the spear. But we have a large number of F-18s, for example, at various bases around the country. And at these bases, as many as half of them are not flyable because they're simply too old, they're worn out, they're out of parts. He explained to me that basically what happened is, let's just say for the sake of the argument that you buy a brand new F-18 Hornet in 1997, let's say, and you expect to get 8,000 flight hours out of it, which might take it to 2020 or whatever, 2030. I'm just making these up, but just to give you the idea. Well, along comes 9/11, and all of a sudden the tempo of operations and sorties goes up so high that we basically burn the lifetime of this airplane out many years before we have a replacement for the airplane scheduled. And this is a serious problem. We put so many flight hours on these aircraft during these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that they're simply just wearing out, and we don't have the means to repair or replace them. That was disturbing. The second thing that was more disturbing was the next morning I got a chance to tour San Diego Harbor with a 3-star admiral who's in charge of surface, surf pack. He owns all the ships in the Navy on the Western Hemisphere, essentially. And we, as we went down San Diego Harbor, we saw a number of ships, large and very expensive warships that were in dry dock, more than they needed to be, more of them and for longer periods. And what I discovered from this admiral is that it's not that we don't have the money to repair these vessels, we don't have the capacity. And essentially, the reason for that is because our Congress can no longer do, it's simply its most primal function, right? It cannot produce a budget. It simply can't. It can't produce a budget. So we have these continuing resolutions, and we're funding the Navy for 3 months, as the rest of the government, or 6, or maybe a year. And the Navy has contracted the repair and refurbishment of these naval combat vessels to private contractors. But since we don't have an annual budget, and since nobody knows how much money is going to be allocated for the Navy in the months, forget the years to come, the private contractors are saying, yes, we'll take the job, but we're not going to staff up for this. We're not going to hire 15,000 people to get these things done in a timely manner when we don't know if we're going to have to fire them again in 3 months because Congress can't decide how much money we're going to pay the Navy. So we have large numbers of warships that are in dry dock and at the side of a pier for longer than they would need to otherwise. I'll just close this by saying, before we get to the questions, as the Admiral pointed out to me, in the 1980s, we had a Navy of 600 ships. During our pregame show, Steve Green disagreed with me. He said the number was far, far less than 600 ship Navy.
Yeah, we never got to 600.
It turns out that Steve was right. The total number was 594, so it wasn't a 600 ship Navy. 1987.
Go Reagan!
1987, we had 594 ships. And when we had 594 naval vessels, about 100 of those were deployed at any given time. Today, we still have to deploy about 100 naval vessels at any given time, but our total fleet's about 270 ships. So the crews are having to work as hard. The ships are working twice as hard. All of these things are increasing wear and tear on these vessels, and it's getting to be a very serious problem. Scott, let's start with you. The Navy is the key to this country. We are bounded by oceans. We're a nation of traders. We are a maritime people. The Navy was essentially the only reason there was an American Republic and continued through the War of 1812. If the government can't do two things, if they can't write a budget, and if they can't fund the Navy, then what the hell is the reason that they're taking $4 trillion from us every year?
Well, and just to clarify something, because this does have an audio component to it, when Bill says we're a nation of traders, he means people who engage in trade.
Trade. Yeah.
Yes.
That's for half of us. The other half is exactly what I meant.
I think, Bill, there's that fundamental problem that you pointed out so poignantly. But there's another, I think, basic problem with how government goes about funding that you can see all around the world hampering all kinds of good things. And that is, for some reason, we will manufacture things, but we never take into account the ongoing cost of operation and replacement. Now in a reasonable business, you set up what's known as a sinking fund that is designed to take care of the ongoing needs of something. So if you make a capital expenditure in something, you say, well, I know it's going to take X amount of money per year to keep operating this during its expected depreciable lifetime. And once we get to 27 years or whatever that lifetime is expected to be, we have to have a plan in place to replace that capital investment. Well, apparently this is unknown in the halls of government. I saw it many times in my brief encounter with county government, where they would constantly do things with no foresight. And I think that's what happens. If you're going to have 600 ships, for example, you either have to have a plan to maintain 600 ships and replace them to keep them at current levels, or you have to have a plan to lose ships little by little and then a lot by a lot, because the ones that were all made in the big fever of war will suddenly all disappear at the same time, And so we have a terrible history of this, and I think it is fundamentally on Congress and our other elected leaders who are unwilling to do the hard work of spending the money that it takes when it's not a crisis. And that's the problem. Right. In wartime, you can raise the money. It's kind of like politicians. That's how they operate all the time. They say, well, we can raise a lot of money during a campaign, but in between campaigns, we can't raise any money to get the message out of the party. So we have to build everything around these thrusts. And I think that's fun. That's going to go on until somebody sits down with the idiots in Congress and says, look, this jet's going to cost you $43 billion to make, and then it's going to cost $27 million a year to operate, and then you're going to have to replace it in 15 years or maybe 3 years if we get into a shooting war.
Steve, the British Empire, when it was at the height of its powers, for about 200 years or so, somewhere in there, had a policy. And the policy was very simple. And the British government simply said this: we will spend whatever we have to spend, so that the Royal Navy is capable of defeating the second and third most powerful navies in the world combined. And they spent according to what the other countries were doing. The other countries backed down, they could spend less. Other countries are building up, they had to spend more. And when they stopped that policy, they stopped being the leaders of the world, and that fell to us. Capacity is something I never hear spoken about. We have amazing weapon systems. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer that I was on is by far the most capable smallish surface ship in the world. It does anti-submarine duty, it does anti-ship duty, anti-air. It's a superb vehicle, but we can probably build 2 or 3 of those a year, assuming we had the funding for it. China can produce ships of that size, in about 10 or 12 of them a year. So we are facing a crisis that is not something we can simply spend our way out of. And somebody needs to be looking a little bit further into the future on these things. I've been a huge critic of cost-plus contracting for years, in terms of why it costs
we've
raises
done
the
whole
cost.
segments on it.
Yep, on things like the F-20, the F-35, and so on. However, as the Admiral pointed out to me, in the case of maintenance, cost plus is in fact what we want, because that means that the private contractors can staff up to whatever level they need to and know that they're going to get paid for it.
Listen, Bill, you already explained the why this landlubber is such a partisan in favor of the Navy, and it's because we are a maritime power, we are a trading nation, and everything we have, this incredible luxury level of life we have is thanks to trade, and the Navy protects that trade. It has since our birth. And these last 200 plus years, 250 years or so, that the world has seen this explosion of trade and wealth and lifted billions out of poverty. The oceans have been ruled by English-speaking peoples, and that's been a wonderful thing because we're the folks who invented capitalism, and we invented the big navies to defend it. It's been a wonderful thing. But when push comes to shove, when the stuff really hits the fan, you can raise an army in a great big hurry. At Stalingrad, the Soviets were given one rifle to every 2 soldiers, and if the guy with the rifle gets shot, you take his rifle. If the guy behind you without the rifle gets shot, you don't have to give yours up. And they fed men into that meat grinder, but it worked. It's expensive in blood, but when the stuff hits the fan, you spend the blood. You can do it. You cannot raise a navy in a hurry. It cannot be done, and the oceans aren't getting any smaller. The ships are getting more powerful. That destroyer you were on is about the size of a World War II cruiser and has more destructive capability to put on target than a World War II aircraft carrier. It's amazing what our ships can do. But the fact is, we still have so much ocean to cover, which means there is a minimum size that our Navy has to be, and it is too dang small. It's in too bad a state of repair, and it's really scary with the aircraft because a modern aircraft squadron has about as much firepower as a World War II naval vessel did, and so the aircraft now take longer to develop and more expense to maintain. And so if we don't take care of our aircraft and our ship needs, we're going to find out very soon someday that somebody like China is going to choke us off, and we're not going to be able to do a damn thing about it.
Bill, I'm reading the last volume of Winston Churchill's biography by William Manchester called The Last Lion. And I just got to the part this morning, and what you and Steve said just brought this home, where Winston Churchill, the prime minister of the nation that had that navy for all that time, that could fight 2 wars against its next 2 top rivals, Winston Churchill writes a letter to Franklin Roosevelt begging him to send him 40 or 50 old, out-of-service ships because they had cut back their military expenditures and their naval maintenance during that era of the 30s of appeasement and blindness to what was happening to them. And the United States said no.
We eventually did give them to them.
Yes, we did.
But they were essentially worthless. And in exchange for that, we got bases like Bermuda for 99 years and so on. And Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty twice before he became Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Listen, the operative point here, I think, that we all need to understand is simply this. Neither the Admiral nor the Squadron Commander were saying we need more money. This is a very, 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 very important point to make. The point they were making is not like, gee, we need more money. The point they were making is we need money delivered in the same way that any business would deliver money. We need to be able to make a contract longer than 3 months. For vessels that take 5 years to build, we cannot write 3-month contracts. We have to be able to treat this as if it was serious. And he's not saying we don't have enough money. The Admiral is saying, in as polite a term as I've ever heard it put, I'm far more volatile in terms of my discussion of this. This man was a complete professional. But when you have nothing but continuing resolutions, then the private sector that we decided should handle the Navy repairs, Navy used to do all their own repairs. We decided to turn that over to the private sector. The private sector is not unreasonable in saying, well, since we don't know how much money we're going to be given over the course of the next 2 years, we will do the work, but we will do it at the cost-effective rate that we're being forced to compete with and not at the rate it's needed. That's the point. So we need to start looking at why we do what we do and this constant dysfunction in Washington on the simplest level. When a Congress of the United States cannot provide a budget for the United States and hasn't done so for a decade, is a disgrace, and it's something we're going to pay for if we don't get this thing sorted out and right quick. We have the best vessels, we have the best crews, and by far we have the best naval officers in the world. But if China can build 10 to 12 destroyers a year and we can build 2, you do the math. So do the math. Let's do something about this while we still have time. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks very much for joining us. It's all made possible by the members at BillWhittle.com.